Hello, Dr. Waters.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you
Good.
hear
This is
and
Dr.
see all
B.
that?
Fine.
All right. There's always a lapse, and I'm always afraid I'm cutting somebody off. So if I am, just let me know. Um, First of all, I want to say that we're recording this, and I wanted to make sure that that was okay with you.
Mhm.
Okay. And this is for our urban education class with Dr. Sarah Ewell. Each of us, myself, Luann Amato, Aaron Lewis, and Darlene Kelly are each in the CTLL program. And we wanted to speak with you regarding culturally responsive pedagogy and how, in your experience, you've seen it assist or apply to urban education. So we have some questions set up if you're ready for us to go through those. We'd like to hear a little bit about your experience. Are you ready for that?
Yeah, I think there seems to be a little bit of connectivity issues.
Okay.
We cut it in and out, so just wanted to be mindful of that.
Okay. Okay. How about each of us? Shall we each try to say hello to see if she can hear each of us to be clear?
Okay. Hello, I'm Darlene Kelly.
Hey.
I'm Luann Amato. I'm down the shore on vacation. So I'm going to mute. When I'm done talking, I'm going to mute because there's a lot of activity going on.
And I'm Aaron Lewis.
All right. All right.
Okay. Aaron, you were breaking up a little bit, but I think we'll be okay.
Okay. So before we get into our set of questions that we each came up with individually, collectively, we wanted to ask, and you've received a copy of the interview questions, so I'm not sure if you were able to get through those, but first and foremost, we'd like to ask if you can briefly provide us some of your background on your position as a professional educator, as a professor that's come to be involved in this doctorate program, what your experience is with culturally responsive teaching. Just kind of give us some background on what it is you do and how you see yourself as a change agent.
That could take up the whole time.
Briefly?
So, um, I think, and forgive me, I just submitted my dossier promotional stuff, so I'm a little bit loopy. I've been up since about 2 o'clock this morning.
Oh, bless you.
So some of this stuff I guess is fresh on my mind. Wow. Well, it you've worked with me before, I think, and Darlene, like I've seen you all before. So
Mm.
most people know that I always identify as an artist and a writer first that just happened to drift into education and into the academy. And I my goal was not to work in education. However, I always worked in after school programs with K through 12, generally middle school students and younger. And the last stint that I had as an after school director, I pretty much fell in love with my kids. And also, I had never really seen teaching like that before. I experienced great teaching as a student, but didn't have the lens or the language to understand it as an adult and as a practitioner. And the teachers that I worked with in that capacity were amazing. So I really wanted to go to graduate school to understand how you get to have amazing teachers that way in an urban ed environment. And yeah, I say and almost like an I'm trying not to say but I say and that way. Anyway, so so I left my students to go to graduate school, which I wasn't crazy about, but I knew that it would put me in a better position in the long run. And when I got to the academy, the readings were really complicated. Nothing seemed to match what I felt was happening on the ground. I just wanted to know about great teaching and art and cultural studies, and all of the language was convoluted from a bunch of old dead people that did not make sense to me. And I took a class called, it was a really long title of a course. Dr. Eileen Parsons taught it, and it was education versus schooling of African American students in K through 12 educational settings or something like that. And that was a class where I met Gloria Ladson Billings' work. And when I picked up the article on culturally relevant teaching, it was accessible language. It reflected what I saw happening in the classrooms. It reflected my experiences. It was everything that I had been waiting for in education. And I could read it. I could understand it. It was amazing. It was like all of a sudden I understood why I was in graduate school. So that's really kind of my path to understanding culturally relevant teaching. Culturally relevant teaching was something that I saw in action. It was something that I experienced as a student. It was something that I did even outside of formal classroom instruction. It was something that I incorporated into my after-school curriculum. I incorporated even when I'm doing my poetry workshops. It wasn't until, like I said, that third or fourth course in grad school that I had the academic language. And for me, and Gloria Ladson-Billings notes this, culturally relevant teaching or pedagogy is a grounded theory that is really based on practice. And for me, that was a standout difference than a lot of theories that I've been exposed to, from this Socrates or Plato or, even Bourdieuian sense, where it was just words on paper as opposed to action in a classroom. So yes. That's that.
Wow. Okay, so incredible and thorough. And I think that's going to lead very nicely into the first question where that Luann had come up with, which is on the sheet you have, Dr. Waters, is question 1, but for question 2. But Luann, if you would like to lead into your question now about how we do that in the classroom, I think that's a great segue.
Yes, I was. And it is from you, Dr. Waters. You said that you've really pretty much you do this, and so what's the first step, do you think, in educating? You do it, but we're trying to get others to do it. We're trying to really get this across the board. I think it's so important. It's so needed. What do you think the first step in educating teachers? For culturally relevant pedagogy, what do you think? What do we have to teach them? Because everyone's not you. We have to be taught. Can we be taught? What do you think?
I think that's the key thing. You have to know who you are, and you have to know what your strengths are. And nobody is a blank slate. I think one of the dangers with culturally relevant teaching that I've seen in the past few years is that, I think when I was going through school, a lot of us had to go through these multicultural programs, and they just became this kind of watered down melting pot of a week's worth of events that celebrated people all around the world but really didn't engage with anything meaningful. And when Gloria Ladson-Billings, in 1995, Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate introduced critical race theory to education, right? And that's significant because critical race theory is built on the premise that we critique structures, that the lived experience is meaningful, and counter narratives to disrupt dominant narratives. So critical race theory is an activist theory. It's both a theory and a method that disrupts social order. And culturally relevant teaching, clearly, when you look at the threads of it, is pulled from CRT, as well as, I would argue, Black feminism and ethic of care. And because of this, the way that it's situated is not warm and fluffy, melting pot, multicultural celebrations of diversity, but the three major tenets of culturally relevant teaching are that you have high expectations of your students. So you are working not from a deficit-based model, but an asset-based model. 2, that you nurture cultural competence of the students, and cultural competence has become another buzzword, but you really appreciate where your students come from. And that's one of the key parts in knowing who you are, because I think some of us as teachers think that we come in as a blank slate. We come in to just kind of learn from you. You teach me who you are, and I can help you with this. But we don't realize that we're actually interrupting the space with our positionalities and our biases and our own narratives, and we aren't transparent about it because I think we don't think that as teachers, there's room to talk about who we are. But when we show up in our gendered and our race and our abilities and our all of these bodies, we tell our students who we are without ever having to open our mouths. So we might as well acknowledge it in the space of cultural competency rather than just saying, you have culture, I'm just here to learn from you. No, it has to be a reciprocal relationship. And then the third piece is that you critique social order. You know, this is done with the case study that Gloria Ladson-Billings wrote out in Dreamkeepers, that if there's something going on in the neighborhood, you guys need traffic lights or speed bumps, or if you live in a food desert, you create programming and curriculum to advocate for that. They can write to their aldermen. They can go out and plant gardens. This is a part of disturbing. We're critiquing the social order that they're in. So the first thing that any person would have to do, whether you're a teacher, whether you're, you know, an administrator, you're an aide, whoever is coming in that class needs to know who they are.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I'm next again. So, from your personal experience, can you describe an incident where a teacher's unfamiliarity with culture created an education gap for students? And I guess I'm really looking for, what does it look like when it's not there? From your perspective, because I lived this. You know, I work with inner city students, adults, and I always feel I'm at a disadvantage because I don't feel I'm giving them everything that they should have. Do you know what I mean? So that's what I'm really looking for. What does it look like when it's really not there? Does that make sense?
I think you, my partner just peeped his head in, sorry. I think you already know the answer to that. When it's not there, it's not there. So, you know, we can share our own stories and experience with that ad nauseum, but one of the things that you said that caught my attention is that, you know, you want to give them, you can't give them everything, right? You want to give them so much, and there's always a lot of need. That goes back to the issue of knowing who you are. And I'm not just saying this to you, but to everybody. Know what you can give. You know, give what you can give and know that that's enough. So, you know, some teachers in our building in different schools that I've worked in have resources where their parents work for computer companies. So they're able to donate laptops. Or people have connections with different restaurants or different park districts. And so in that way, there are very tangible resources that you can give. Or if you love art, you know, and you love writing, those are other forms of resources that you can give. But when you start looking at the whole child and you start thinking about their whole life and everything that you want to do to make it better, you can fall into the savior complex, because it's not your job to do everything. It's only your job to do what you can do. So if you own your gift and you share that, that's how you are a change agent. Everything else is too dangerous and it's not for you to take on.
Thank you. That was great.
Okay, Doctor, I've always called you Dr. B, and here we're being more formal and calling you Dr. Waters. What would you prefer? How do you
I always prefer Dr. B.
Okay.
My full last name is Sankofa-Waters, and I know, and that's a full explanation in itself.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. B is not informal for me at all because you're calling me by my title. And so that's
all right.
fine.
So then I'm going to go back to Dr. B, because it's almost uncomfortable when I say Dr. Waters, because I know it's not the whole name. So, okay, so Dr. B, so then that leads into my question, where we talk about, like, we do what we can do, but oftentimes we have students, and really, and I'm learning through this process that it doesn't have to be in an urban classroom or a rural classroom. Like, the bottom line is that we come to any classroom where students have these sort of competing ideas or perspectives on what home and society teach them and what, you know, the rest of the world is trying to teach them. And so in your role as an educator and as your role as a teacher educator, how vital do you see that role of mediation? Like for us as educators, in what ways can we sort of process, adjust, or balance between those two potentially confusing ideologies and perspectives that students come to the classroom with?
That's a heavy question.
Okay.
I think, you know, we first have to mediate the complexities that we come in the classroom with. You know, we talk about, for one, there's the hidden curriculum that we all have to be aware of. What are we really trying to teach our students? Are we trying to teach them to matriculate? Are we trying to give them social and cultural capital? And then from my perspective as an African American woman or a Black woman, I'm always very aware of the double consciousness that is necessary for our students to have in moving through spaces that where their culture is not reflected in the classroom or in the curriculum. And so, and that double consciousness can be a triple consciousness. You know, it doesn't just have to be, you know, the binary of black and white, but, you know, also gender, sexuality, ability, religious, all of that. So all of these consciousnesses, I think I think one of the concerns that's always raised is that once I start becoming aware of everything, I'm aware of everything. And, you know, everybody shows up in the room with 100 different identities. How do you speak to that? And I don't have an answer for that, but I think being aware that there are different modes of communication, that there are different languages. And the more concrete answer that I can give is, you know, my work is specifically with parents. And so that bridge, and Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about this, you know, specifically with culturally relevant teaching, that it's not just an anthropological fit or a linguistic fit, but you're really talking about the space between home and school, that those are two different institutions. And if the parent is, you know, the home expert or identified as the home expert, whether you agree with their parenting style or not, that's your key stakeholder, for lack of a better word. And so that gets into a larger conversation about parent involvement. You know, many of us have to gripe with the fact that a lot of parents don't show up for whatever reason, or are unable to participate, or don't participate in the way that we think they need to, you know, in school activities or showing up for the kid. But for me, because that is my positionality and my research, that's where all of my work is. Finding out where the parents are and helping meet their needs, so when the children leave our site, we have a circular line of communication for that child. And that's culturally relevant too. I mean, yeah.
All right. Yeah, something that you said was, you know, sometimes we come with a double consciousness or a triple consciousness, that there are so many different ways, hundreds of different awarenesses about who we are and how we identify, and sometimes where do you start? And something just 2 weeks ago at residency, that was a topic of conversation that one of the professors presented through a positionality statement, like where do we begin to identify? And so because that spectrum is so broad, and because the spectrum is sometimes so different from one person to another, from one teacher to a student, and because that role of mediation is so critical and so vital and really so inclusive, what do you think we can start doing differently? Because you've commented on the multicultural programs, and even at my master's level, we had the most, I mean, it was so impractical, the multicultural education class that we were required to take. It was like, present another culture you've seen. And I had just returned from a cruise from Belize, and so I literally put together a PowerPoint with pictures from Belize, and I got an A, because I spent time in another culture. It was that heady, almost. Like there was no real cultural immersion, no understanding that came of it. And so naturally, as we're saying here and as we're seeing in this program at NEU, a lot of changes need to occur at the pre-service level. So what can we start to do that's more meaningful in those pre-service programs to maybe offer a more empathetic approach to teachers? Like, how might they approach the non-dominant culture or that double or triple consciousness? How can they begin to address that on a realistic, personal basis with students? What tools might they need to go into the classroom to address that with?
That's $1 million question, and I can say from my perspective, I'm a poet, and so one of the tools at my disposal is using the where I'm from exercise. And so we have these, hundreds of identities that each of us show up with, but the where I'm from poem exercise asks a student or a person to self-identify the parts that are most important to them, that they feel comfortable sharing out, in a public space or a safe space. And so that can be a building ground, different poetry activities, icebreaking. And, every time I've done this exercise, I have, a number of students that tell me they hate poetry, they hate writing, they don't like it. But at the base, everybody kind of wants to be able to tell their own story, and everybody wants to be heard. And there certainly are students, in the exercise, and I've done this exercise K through 12, higher ed, doc students, everybody. Everybody may not share out and perform, but everybody's going to write something down. We want to know ourselves, and we want to be more informed about ourselves. So the exercise is never null. That's always a way for me to kind of break the ice for identities in a room. And the other is, and with that, so there's the privilege walk. I think somebody just did, BuzzFeed just did like a 5-minute clip about the privilege walk. It's something that I take for granted that I think most of us may be familiar with, but I believe it largely comes out of Peggy McIntosh's work on unpacking the knapsack. And so let me just, have you guys heard of the privilege walk before? Are you familiar with it?
No, I'm not. I'm curious. I'm writing it down now as you speak of it.
So it's a difficult exercise. Let me say that at first, right? So have you ever heard, like, I think there was an exercise like in the 60s or 70s with the blue eyes, brown eyes. Are you all familiar with that exercise? Okay, save that for another time. Look it up later. Okay. So the privilege walk is, so say that all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of us were in a room, and we started on the same line, and there were blocks in front of us. We would have about 10 to 20 prompts to either move forward, stand still, or move back. And so you move forward if you feel comfortable buying a home in an area where you know your children will be able to play outside. Move forward if you had lunch every day, without thinking about it. Move forward if you were able to go to college without, so there are about 10 prompts that range across class. They're different sets of prompts, I think, but generally they all run around race, class, gender, sexuality issues.
Mm-hmm. And
what happens at the end of the exercise, you see who's in the front of the room, who's in the back, who's staggered, and it's incredibly emotional. It can be incredibly impactful, and the exercise itself may not take longer than 10 minutes, but the debriefing can take hours. So I've done smaller exercises like that in the residencies, and there are different exercises, again, like that you can do with pre-service teachers, and I've had several of them from the Introduction to Doctoral Studies class actually adopt them for their students in their K through 12 classrooms. So, and they can do it in that space because they've already spent months with these students. They kind of know where they are. You can't do this with people you just met off the street. It's too emotional and too loaded. But if you have relationships with them, it's a way to really get conversations going about privilege and power and how to navigate that and how to leverage it for one another. So I feel like I just said a whole lot.
Well, I
So
think a lot of what you said, I think, comes back to this sense of awareness, the awareness of our surroundings, the awareness of our students, the awareness of ourselves and our own positionality and our own identifications. And so I think, I mean, that's certainly what I've gotten a lot out of that. And I've done similar, the marble activity, which is very similar to this, where it's more random and not as personalized, but it still creates a room where privilege exists and non-privilege exists, and people are treated accordingly, and people get to see what that feels like when they have privilege and when they don't. So I think that, thank you so much for answering my questions, because I know they were loaded ones, but I think that will effectively segue into Erin's discussion about classroom management and how we use that awareness to manage the diverse classroom populations that we face. So I'll turn it over to Erin now.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, we're kind of heading into the practice of CRP, as you mentioned before, and so speaking of all the identities in the classroom, how does a teacher establish classroom management routines in a culturally diverse classroom? Or in other words, do you as a teacher kind of set up rules that are efficient for you, or do you kind of tweak them depending upon the students in front of you? So maybe every term or every year?
Yes. And I will say this is a difficult question as well, because when I hear classroom management, I always hear behavior problems, right?
Yeah.
And there's no clean answer for that. So I'm not going to say I don't know how to answer that, but I don't. um, One of the things, so with culturally relevant teacher, one of the things we definitely harp on in the beginning of the article are the three tenets that Gloria Ladson-Billings espouses for how to do a culturally relevant pedagogy. But there are other 3 points for the teachers that they have to do in order to be in a position to successfully move through culturally relevant pedagogy. And one of them is, again, like I said earlier, knowing who you are, so being reflexive, knowing what you bring to the classroom, and that changes, right? So having a conception of self and others. The second point, I'm looking up my list just to make sure that I'm not telling you guys the wrong thing. Construction of social relations. So I equate that with having an ethic of care and empathy, and we'll argue that most teachers have that. That's not the issue. The issue is stress. And then the last one is conceptions of knowledge, which shift. And I'll say that goes beyond textbook knowledge, but professional development knowledge, collaborative community knowledge, what we think we know about the population that we're working with. So when it comes to classroom management, I mean, a lot of that comes down to personality, and it does come down to training and the type of school that you're in. If you are working in a school culture that believes in suspension and sending the students to the principal's office, that may be the way that things just have to go, because the students are used to that culture and they respond to that culture. There's a lot of work. So we talk about the long time there's been an argument around the achievement gap. A lot of critical race theorists have transitioned this argument to the opportunity gap, and there's also now work around the discipline gap. So a lot of gaps. And that work I'm not as familiar with, to be honest, but it may be a string to pull to look for more information with respect to classroom management styles and culturally relevant pedagogy. Because I know Gloria Ladson-Billings, I'm pretty sure she specifically talks about that as well. It's just because I'm not in the classroom anymore, I'm not intimately familiar with it.
That's great information for us to kind of go and delve more into. Going back to Latin Billings, as part of culturally relevant pedagogy, obviously students should experience academic success. What does academic success look like to the teacher for culturally diverse students? You know, not everyone is going to be getting A's. And how do you think success should be measured?
I don't. Anytime a student or a teacher uses the word success to me, I ask them to define it. It's not fixed, and so that's my answer. Um, and again, it comes to the students self-identifying. You know, what you may think is successful, your student and that parent and the teacher and the curriculum may say something completely different. And this is why I always have a difficult time giving grades or assigning grades or you earn grades because success is really is relative. But when you have report cards, it's absolute.
Yeah.
So in a culturally relevant pedagogy classroom, you have to figure that out each term, each class, each student. And the more you do it, the more it will become organic and the more it will feel natural, but it cannot be a fixed rule. That's what reform is for. That's what NCLB and Common Core and all of that is for. If you want to be creative, then you allow the students and you to figure that out for yourselves.
So definitely portfolios and progress with, you know, portfolios would be more useful for measuring, you know, the success in terms of, you know, any student, in particular, culturally diverse students.
Yeah, there are different models in all kinds of schools, so it's also, you know, really hard to speak to that definitively just because there are too many ways to look at that. And at the end of the day, for some schools and for some students, it simply is getting an A, not even earning whatever that means, but getting an A. And so for me, in combating that, I'm always pushing to ask my students, regardless of the setting, what did you learn? Sure, you may have gotten an A, but what did you actually learn? What are you walking away with? How was your life going to be different? What are you going to do? You know, how do you interact? How does this change how you interact with your peers? How do you, you know, and honestly, time-wise, you may not be able to do that with every single student. But again, the more you become comfortable with it, it can become organic. Like there is no easy answer for that. It is the trial and error of education. And the prayers that the seeds you plant will flourish even if it's not in your quarter, your semester. It's a faith walk.
I like that.
Okay, Dr. B, can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for agreeing to interview with us today. And my first question has to do with, you've spoken quite a bit about CRP in the public schools, but as a whole, and although you're not in the public school now, in your view, do you think that CRP is being implemented? Because I know you mentioned in some of our readings, we also read about multicultural education. So I wondered if you could just speak to the fact that in your mind or in your thinking that culturally relevant pedagogy is still kind of on the minds of people, or is it kind of going by the way for multicultural education? Just curious.
Okay. So one of the pressures with doing an interview like this is that, especially with students you care about, you want to be able to answer all their questions, and sometimes you just really don't have the answer because you are a so-called expert in one space, and that is all you know.
Right.
So let me preface what I'm about to say with that.
Okay.
and also the disclaimer that I think earlier, I have a tongue-in-cheek attitude about multiculturalism just because I've seen it and experienced it in a watered-down fashion. However, there are a lot of curriculums that still use multiculturalism as a term and in practice that is very effective. So let me first say that. And the work not just of Gloria Ladson-Billings, but Geneva Gay and James Banks, all work in this frame. So the names, we don't want to split hairs about names, but the work at the heart is, again, about, high expectations, cultural competency, and challenging social order. So I definitely think that those are happening in different spaces. Sometimes we may not recognize them because of how they're identified by name. As theorists and researchers, a lot of us are caught up in trying to name what we do so that it kind of separates itself out. But yes, I think it's alive and well. I think the heart of critiquing order and change and hope and faithfulness and these amazing students that are graduating is happening. We're experiencing that. And what's really awesome, like one of the things that I absolutely love Gloria Ladson-Billings. You would think that she's paying me or I know her, she's a friend, but she doesn't. I just love her. And I would encourage any of you all to follow her on Twitter or on Facebook because she's incredibly accessible that way. This is a woman who, along with Bill Tate, introduced CRT to education, but she's still very much pressed in everything that's happening. So whereas she's responsible for culturally relevant pedagogy, right now she's really a proponent of hip-hop education, which is a component that is a part of critical media literacy and pop culture, and a way that she recognized, along with other scholars like Chris Emdin and Bettina Love, that hip-hop is the language of our students that are coming into the classroom. And if you really want to engage conversations with them, critiquing social order around race, class, gender, sexuality, and otherness, you need to get into hip-hop. And that's a hashtag and a trending conversation that I think happens on Tuesdays and Thursdays on Twitter. That's amazing. So, it's culturally relevant pedagogy by another name. And so you can still see the work. You can see threads of the work. Sometimes you have to pull the threads out to tease them out to see exactly what's happening. But yes, it's there. And much like hip-hop, sometimes when the message gets co-opted by the masses, we have to change it to something different and be covert about it so that it's still doing its function. And I think hip-hop ed functions that way. So yeah, that's my soapbox moment about that.
The reason I'm sorry, that was one of my young students that I have this summer, and I guess now I'm conscious because since I work in a higher ed environment, I'm conscious of, even when we have the young people doing the summer, sometimes they have them doing, he works in the library, okay, so I'm trying to make sure that we just don't get him to do very rote kinds of things, but to have him built in things that he has to critically think. He's only 14, so he's asking about coffee cake. Can he take the rest of the coffee? And I was like, yes, please. Like, can I take the coffee cake? He didn't just take it.
Sit down and talk with him about what he's listening to.
Yeah.
Sit down and talk with him about Kendrick Lamar.
I will do that. So the next question has to do with, and from our perspective, and I guess for us and for me, my colleagues have been so supportive. I don't think they know how much, because nobody thinks that this library does all this work. But I got to tell you, you would never believe we're in Watts, okay? And we just celebrated the 50th year anniversary, and I came to work on Saturday, thinking I'd be here for like an hour. I had a hat on, okay? God. And my boss looked at me like, where is she going looking like that? So it was an all-day event. So needless to say, it was almost 100 degrees. And in California, in the drought season, 100 degrees feels like 100 degrees. But we've been hearing from our readings that the professional development activities and teacher education programs is where this really takes place. And I'm just wondering, in your thoughts, so are we really implementing it, or do you think perhaps maybe those schools that are more aligned with social justice, you might find it, or do you think it's just all over do you think it might be taught as a standard now, or is it considered part of a standard? Or are we still putting it under multicultural? I'm just curious. I'm sorry, guys. I just kind of like to ad lib and see my hands go like that, I think. Sorry.
I can't speak intelligently to that, but what I can say is that interacting with you all in this program who are in various spaces and classroom and supervising positions, I see you all doing it. You know, I see it in your projects. I see it in the conversations that we're having on the discussion boards. So to me, that signals that yes, it is happening.
Okay.
Even if it isn't coming from a PD, from a so-called expert coming in training you guys, you all are having the conversations. So again, in that way, of course, I think these conversations, not just the conversations are alive well, but the applications are happening because I see them in your projects. So, and yes, there are specific schools, you know, the social justice school here, Candizi School in Atlanta, Urban Prep. There are specific schools that do this, but I think even more so are, you know, individual teachers who are taking this up, who are becoming familiar with James Banks' work and all of this and sharing it with other faculty members, and that's how a fire spreads. So, yeah, it's alive and well because we're talking about it right now. Is it in every classroom? No. Does it need to be in every classroom? Sure. But for right now, it's living.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar. I know one of the first, I would say, YouTube videos that we did review was someone, Dr. Raspberry, I believe it was. Are you familiar with her? She's from the Chapel Hill area.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. Because I think I remember you being from North Carolina or had gone to Duke or something in that.
I did not go to Duke.
Oh my God.
The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
I grew up in South Carolina, so I always felt like I had some little affinity with North Carolina. Very little.
Melissa graduated from Chapel Hill as well. I'm very familiar with her.
Okay. And so so the work that she's doing, I would guess that's something that we all, because I know she encouraged us to kind of get involved in that with the virtual piece, because I think oftentimes what happens is that people are just so busy. You know, and so maybe if they had time that they can do this or whatever, that might be helpful. And you kind of spoke to this, the last question, and thank you, group, for indulging me. You've already talked about implementing it, how one might, some strategies. And I like the thing about the poetry. So you spoke about poetry, you spoke about the privilege walk, and I'm going to be teaching this fall. And I thought, oh, wow, let me get some ideas that, you know, and I just wondered if there were any other ideas that you could think of that might be useful in a higher ed setting. My institution is a health science area, and what I've seen already, we've just started with registration last week, and we had several things that didn't go right, technical difficulties, and I already noticed that there were groups of people. Some of the students are younger, some of them are older. So I'm always sensitive to that, me being an older student. And so the first thing they'll say to you is, oh, I don't understand the technology. Oh, and I know that several of them are in my class, and I'm just trying to figure out what I can do to make them feel a little bit more comfortable. Because I do believe in my heart that when a student comes back to school, whether they're 20 or they're 80, you know, a lot of times things have changed, and in order to keep them vested in understanding that they can do this, you know, maybe there's something that, like as you said earlier, each of us could do. And I wondered if there was any thoughts that anything you could think of that we could do. I'm speaking primarily for myself at this point.
Well, Darlene, so you bring up two different things. You got a lot going on, and I don't want to lose what I was getting ready to say. So the first is that part of that is just logistical. You know, that's an ebb and flow that we have to get used to when we have students matriculating, and you know, that can be a trial and error kind of thing. But going back to what you were talking about specifically with the poetry and the privilege walk and different exercises that you can do for engagement and really looking at culturally relevant pedagogy, I want to be clear, again, how I opened, knowing who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So the poetry exercise can be very awesome, but that's something that I've done for about 10 years, and I'm a poet. I would
Mm-hmm.
never suggest that somebody do that on day one
Mm-hmm.
without being comfortable with it, because it can blow up in your face.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing with the privilege walk.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I've done in several different settings. I've had it performed kind of on me and with a group of people I love, opposed to a group of strangers. So whenever
Absolutely.
you're doing these exercises with the intent to build community and to break ice and to really ask people to dig into their identities and share who they are in a space, you have to know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have done it for a while. You know,
Okay.
don't just get excited about something that you hear
Mm-hmm.
and go, oh yeah. No, no, run a pilot a couple of
Mm-hmm.
times, and then go for it. Because I think that's sometimes where we shoot ourselves in the foot with this
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm.
We get excited. We want to go back tomorrow and say, hey, I got this great thing, and it's going to make you guys better, and we're going to be awesome, and you're going to, this is going to help you. And it's like, no, you just murdered the opportunity for change.
Mm-hmm.
So know what your ability, know what your gifts are, what you can contribute,
Mm-hmm.
and take your time with them.
Okay.
Social justice and culturally relevant pedagogy is a slow roll. So excitement is necessary, but rushing does not help. And I say that because I saw the lights go off in your eyes, Darlene, and
Yeah.
I don't want any of us, you know, not just you, but
Mm-hmm.
anybody that's listening to this, to rush into something
Mm-hmm.
with great intentions and not pull it off to the full capacity.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Laura?
Dr. B, that definitely, well, it brings us to the end of our questions, and we've had you for almost an hour, so we're so grateful for your time. One of the overarching questions that Dr. Ewell has asked us to deliver, and a lot of our literature review that we've done involves Geneva Gay and Lansing Billings and James Banks. And her big question, or you know, the big picture of everything that we've been doing is, how does it connect necessarily to specifically urban education? And so a lot of what I've read and Ladson Billings has you know, stated is that it's not just in urban education classrooms where we need to see this, but specifically for this course, is there something that you could say to that end, how particularly it plays the biggest role in urban education specifically?
Y'all are asking some serious questions. Y'all make me feel like I know what I'm talking about. I don't know. I think one of the dangers in naming a theory is that you can get locked into those names and those tenets. And, you know, a lot of us are, you know, we want templates and examples of how to do things, when this is a theory that really grew out of creativity and experience and innovation and kind of playing around with something. Not saying that it isn't intelligently crafted, absolutely, but like you said, it's not just something that lives and breathes solely in urban education, but any space where difference has to be acknowledged, which is every space, you know.
Yeah.
And I definitely don't want to use the language of minority and majority, but every person needs to be represented, which means every culture has to be acknowledged, and everybody has to be honest about what they're bringing to a space. So in that way, again, if the heart of culturally relevant teaching is high expectations, cultural competence, and critiquing social order, that happens anywhere. And it first has to happen with the instructor, and then we can talk about how it happens with faculty before it even gets to the students. Sometimes we want to jump to, having the students be awesome when the faculty are not even getting along and can't be transparent with one another. So we probably need to exercise the privilege walk and where I'm from and culturally relevant exercises as a faculty before we ever take it to our students. And I think that's my response generally. So if you have those three components, you could do it in the garage,
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think this has helped all of us, most specifically within this course, but I'm probably going to celebrate the most dramatically because a lot of this is part of my building my dissertation, culturally responsive pedagogy. It's given me specifically and personally a lot of insight. I think we've gathered quite a bit, and we're in quite a time, and we think this will work well for our project. So.
Cool.
So I want to say thank you personally, and I would like to say thank you.
There was a little reverb. I think you said thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, no problem.
Thank you, Dr. Banks.
And I'll make this link available to you so that you can also have access to the interview. It'll be on my YouTube, and I'll share it with you, just so that you have it.
Thank y'all. Thank you all for doing the work.
Thank you.
You all are amazing, so keep me posted.
Will do. All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night. We appreciate your time.